Look, I mean, from the very beginning, there has been a kind of tendency to sort of presume what Arab attitudes are. Now, to be fair, some of it is based on Arab leaders saying to our leaders, in a lot of ways, what our leaders assume coming in, great hostility towards Israel, great hostility towards the U.S.-Israeli relationship, a belief that somehow our relationship with the Arabs is damaged by this. And so three assumptions really sort of formed over time. One was if we would distance ourselves from Israel, we would gain with the Arabs. And 5 administrations do that, but they never gain. 2 is that if it's a corollary, 2 is if we would cooperate with Israel, we would really lose with the Arabs. And the third was we could never transform our position in the region, nor change the region itself unless we solve the Palestinian issue. And obviously, as someone who spent 30 years trying to deal with that, I care a lot about that, but it was never going to be the game changer in the region that was assumed, because there was a kind of misreading of what were the most important priorities for Arab leaders.
Well, let me take a couple of examples. Yeah. One would be H.W. Bush, and the other would be H. Bush.
Right.
The first President Bush and the second President Bush. The first President Bush did distance himself, as did Jim Baker and others, from the Israelis. The second President Bush seemed to allow zero daylight between himself and the Israelis, but he didn't get any further.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, just apropos of what you said about the no daylight. I note in the Obama chapter that President Obama meets with a group of Jewish leaders in July of 2009. And one of them says to him, if you want the Israelis to move on peace, you have to get right next to them. And the president says, for 8 years, there was no daylight between the Bush administration and the Israelis. The Israelis sat on the sideline, did nothing, and it cost us with the Arabs. Now, it was not great history because, after all, in that period, Sharon withdrew 100% settlements and IDF from Gaza because there was a kind of closeness. The mistake of the Bush administration was not to take advantage of that, not to sort of build in advance, all right, look, Israel's going to withdraw, how can we use that? And then Olmert goes beyond the Clinton parameters. He goes to Abu Mazen, he says, let's cut through it all. And he offers, to resolve all the core issues. I say he goes beyond the Clinton parameters in one issue, on territory. Because basically he offers 6.3% annexation of the West Bank for settlement blocks, 5.8% swap, and then the 0.5% is compensated for by the safe passage or the free passage between Gaza and the West Bank. Now, those moves weren't reciprocated, on the one hand. They were made because there was a sense of being close.
If Sharon and Olmert were still, in power, would there be an agreement?
I don't know if there'd be an agreement, but it's hard, because a lot depends on the Palestinians.
Right.
But certainly, they were prepared to move very far. The fact is, in Olmert's case, Olmert was prepared, as I said, to go beyond the Clinton parameters.
But don't you think Sharon could have gotten an agreement?
Yes.
Then don't you think
because he had the credibility,
then is partly to blame for the fact that we don't have one?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't know that Abu Mazen would have responded. Because to take an agreement, it takes two. No, I don't. No, I don't. Honestly, I think, look, 3 times since the year 2000, we have offered things, and there has been either a rejection or no answer. In 2000, we did the Clinton parameters, and Arafat rejected it.
Yeah.
In 2008, Olmert laid out everything, and he got no answer. In 2014, March 17, 2014, President Obama presents to Abu Mazen principles to resolve the core issues, asks for a response, and never gets one. So
yeah, but I mean, we'll get to the Palestinian leadership issue in a moment, but don't you think there's an Israeli leadership issue?
We don't have in Israel today a government that is prepared to do the kind of things that we saw Sharon, Olmert, or Rabin do. That's a fact.
Now, Kerry this morning was giving a talk and talked about Arab-Israeli peace.
Right.
He still seems to be on it. A, should he just give it up for the moment? And B, on the alternative, should you just lay down a plan? Say, how about this plan?
Look, I'm a big believer that in diplomacy or the use of force, you don't create binary choices where you say, we're going to put boots on the ground or we're going to do nothing, or we're going to solve this conflict or we're going to do nothing. Because when you put binary choices out and you can't produce the ambitious outcome, you'll do nothing. Now, in the Middle East, one of the things we've seen, when you do nothing, you create a vacuum, and we see which forces fill it. I am against us doing nothing right now because we see what's going on right now. We have, between Israelis and Palestinians right now, I don't know that we have a third intifada because this isn't organized, there's no structure, there's no leadership. But 15 to 25-year-olds are carrying out almost a daily basis stabbings or acts of terror, and there is a sense that nothing is being done, there's nothing to lose, there's frustration, there's anger. So doing nothing is clearly not the answer. And laying a plan down I think you lay a plan down right now, I think you get 2 no's. So I would be in favor of focusing on what can you do to diffuse tension, what can you do to begin to restore a sense of possibility. Today there's no sense of possibility on either side. It convinces each side that nothing can be done, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So our doing nothing certainly contributes to this. But laying a plan down right now that is going to be rejected by both sides is going to deepen the sense that nothing can be done. I would focus very heavily on the following. First, I'd start on how do you begin to restore a sense of possibility? How do you begin to restore a sense of belief? Both sides are convinced that the other will never do 2 states. So I would begin to address how can we get each side to prove that they favor 2 states? I would focus on issues like, for example, on the Israeli side, one of the things I would ask the Israelis to do, you say you're for 2 states for 2 peoples. The Prime Minister said it when he came here, he said it at the UN. So I say, how about you make your settlement policy consistent with the 2-state outcome? Which means build in the blocks, but don't build outside the blocks. You don't build in 92% of the territory.
And what would Netanyahu's government say now?
Well, they would probably say no, but you might get into a conversation where they'd say, all right, what are the Palestinians going to do? You're asking only of us. And I'd say to the Palestinians, all right, let's look at, you say you're for 2 states. How come there's no Palestinian map that shows Israel? How about we have a Palestinian map that shows Israel? How about, I could come up with a list on each side and I think that could be a basis for discussion. I'd like the Israelis to open up Area C. You've spent a lot of time working on economic issues. Area C is 60% of the West Bank. How about the Palestinians should be allowed to build in Area C housing? Okay? On the Palestinian side, how about the Palestinians acknowledge that there's 2 national movements, and that's why you need 2 states for 2 peoples? I'm not saying you have to say Jewish state today, but the fact that the Palestinians will go out of their way to say, we can't say anything about Israel as a state of the Jewish people.
Yeah, your friend Salam Fayyad would say all of those things, right?
He would, but he's
not the Prime Minister anymore.
And he was forced out.
Right.
He was.
So what you're saying is there are potential leaders of the Palestinian movement who could easily get there, but we don't have them now.
That's right.
And how do we encourage that change?
Well, I think, again, part of what has to happen is to show, A, a level of effort on our side, B, focus on restoring a sense of possibility. Leaders who might be prepared to do something are more inclined to emerge in a context where it looks like something can be done.
Who would be the Palestinian leader you'd be hoping wins the Iowa caucuses? Or the Bethlehem caucus?
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be Trump, but look.
Our ratings just went up.
Yeah.
Say the one word, and all of a sudden people are tuning in.
Yes. I would look. Obviously, you mentioned Salam Fayyad. Salam Fayyad is someone who, he would do something that the Palestinian national movement desperately needs. The history of the Palestinian national movement is a tendency to focus on symbols, not substance. He focused on substance and not symbols. Now he doesn't come from either Fatah, he doesn't come from Hamas, he doesn't come from one of the movements, and that's a detriment. But he's practical. Now the question is, can you have some kind of coalition of different Palestinians who could emerge? But Fayyad would be someone who, if you could create a sense of possibility again, then someone like that might have more credibility.
And what about on the Israeli side? If you create possibility, is there another government or coalition?
Well, I think you probably have to broaden. I mean, if you could broaden this government, if this government had Bougie Herzog join it, then the kind of thing I was suggesting about you don't build outside the blocks, that becomes very possible.
But at the moment, it's almost the opposite. The people he has brought into the coalition are ones least likely to say that.
Well, in fact, when I say open up Area C, Naftali Bennett is a believer that Area C should be annexed.
Right.
Now,
that's
the
what
Prime Minister of Israel is not doing that. But, if you're going to broaden the government...
So this is unsustainable, and the occupation, as most of the world calls it, is unsustainable, right? What about disengagement?
Yeah, because disengagement or separation, I think, is a way to go. Again, politically, it's not going to be so easy right now. But again, you have to begin to create a sense of possibility, and then what is rejected right now is looked at differently. What do I mean by what you mean by disengagement, or what I mean by separation?
Separation. I'll go with your words, obviously.
Right. What I mean by separation, this is, if you can't negotiate a peace agreement right now, which I don't think you can, but you do have to create a sense of possibility, and at the same time within Israel, Prime Minister of Israel says, we are not going to become a binational state. If things stay as they are, Israel will become a binational state. You can't say exactly when, but the truth is the demographics have a certain logic to them. And the truth is, even for those who sort of say, well, it's not going to be tomorrow, it's true, it's not going to be tomorrow. But if you're talking about Israel as a state of the Jewish people, well, what happens when it's suddenly 60-40, not 80-20? It's not exactly what the Zionist ethic, Zionist dream was. So separation is, in a sense, what Rabin had in mind. In 1994, I actually say it in this book, Rabin says to me, we are going to, in the end, we're going to have some kind of a partition. I prefer to negotiate it. But if we can't negotiate it, that's why I'm building the separation wall. It's interesting, Rabin, not Sharon, not Barak, Rabin was the author of the separation barrier. And he said, because if we can't negotiate a two-state outcome, if we can't negotiate a partition, then we're going to separate. And separation means this is how you preserve. You separate from the Palestinians. Now, exactly how you define what separation is in terms of the number of settlers outside the blocks. 80% of the settlers are within blocks, and those blocks are within 5% of the Green Line.
Right, and that's all within the Taba or even the Omer or whatever agreement.
What we were
know where that
proposing,
line would be.
Right, we have a very good sense of what that would be. So you get 80% of the settlers there. 20% of the settlers live to the east of the security barrier. And so, now today that's probably 80 to 100,000 settlers. Now, when you remove 9,000 settlers from Gaza, that was a trauma. The idea that 80,000 would leave, that's not so simple. Now, there's a lot of ways you could promote it. One, you create incentives to move back, financial incentives. Two, you start building housing for those who would leave. Because one of the things that was done that was a mistake in Gaza, there was no real preparation in terms of housing for those who were leaving. So you do these kinds of things to create But if we could do an approach to separation, what are you prepared to do with the Israelis? What are you prepared to do with the Palestinians? What kind of responsibilities could you help out assuming? And to the Europeans, you say, if this were to be done, how might your approach towards the Israelis change? And how might your approach towards the Palestinians change? Would you not say at that point to the Palestinians, look, the Israelis are doing something, what are you going to do? I mean, in a sense, separation can be a vehicle to a different diplomatic approach. And what I'm suggesting right now is we're stuck. But if you say, well, gee, I'm going to put a peace plan on the table that no one's going to accept, or I'm going to do nothing, then we're going to remain stuck. And I'm trying to suggest, A, we can't afford being stuck, and B, we have to think a little differently than we have.
Well, I want to try to keep my promise. I have about 8 more questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I wanted to keep my promise of opening it up. So, yes, there.
Hi, my name is Tara. I work for the BBC, and I want to ask you about Iran and about Hillary Clinton's comments about a possible military strike against Iran if they weren't following their international agreement. And one time she slipped and said nuclear strike, which I know she didn't mean. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about whether you both agreed with that strategy, or how you talked about the strategy to say that there would be a military strike, and how you came to that thinking, and what that might mean for the future.
Well, I think I was the core of the agreement, and you're going for a nuclear weapon, and you suddenly have an infrastructure that allows you to move quickly, at that point we would use force. Well, I think the clearer we are on that, the more certain we are in terms of what my terminology would be, the more certain we are in terms of creating a firewall. If the world knows it and the Iranians know it, the more likely they are to ever be deterred, never to be tempted to go for such a weapon. That's what she was getting at, and I think that's the right posture. That's the posture we ought to have.
Garrett?
Thanks very much. Dennis, this is basically a question that goes at the observation made long ago by Abba Eban about the Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I guess my question is, it really has two parts to it. First of all, is that something that he meant and we should take seriously? And second, thinking about these small steps that you talked about in a separation process, including putting an Israel on the maps in Palestine, et cetera, is there leadership anywhere in Palestine that can pull that off today?
Look, what makes it, I'll say it this way about Abba Eban. You have a two-part question, as you said. I mean, at the time, yes, I think he meant it. He meant that they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think what that reflects Israelis. They're competing to be who can be tougher towards the Israelis. And that's why I'm saying we need to think a little differently right now about how we proceed, because that's the context in which we're operating.
To move to current events for a second. There's been a lot of discussion, sort of interestingly, about the implications of the Syrian, I won't use the word Nakba, disaster for the relationships between Israel and the Sunni established states.
Yeah.
But there's been relatively little discussion about the implications of the Syrian mess for the relation between between Israel and the United States, or the David Ignatius.
States right now tend to look at the Israelis as a bulwark against Iran. Egypt and Jordan are cooperating with the Israelis because of the nature of radical Islamist threats that they see, and that cooperation is really beyond anything we've seen previously. And by the way, that sort of gets back to my point about if you did something on separation, could you then go to the Arab states and say, look, they were in. At the time, they were saying they weren't there for a picnic. They were there planning to create a new front, which is probably true. But not far from them, you'll have elements of the Nusra Front. Not ISIS, but the Nusra Front. So and when I've asked Israelis, all right, between those two, and their answer is, we have no preference. We'd like them to fight each other as long as possible. But it does mean that the Israelis have an interest in what's going on there. We have seen the Israelis on never admit, but at least indirectly acknowledge that on probably 6 or 7 occasions when they've seen weapons transferred from Syria to Hezbollah, they cross the threshold. The Israelis, I know someone you were sitting next to this morning would sort of relate well to this suggestion I'm about to make. It would be a good time for us to do more to promote contingency planning to different kinds of outcomes that could emerge from Syria, but contingency planning with the Israelis and with these key Arab states. Is financed, trained, armed by the Iranians.
Let me push back on you a bit, though,
Sure.
which is you talk about having no dogs in a hunt.
Right.
Maybe why are we have to be so aligned with the Sunni side of this struggle? And you go back to Nixon and Kissinger.
Right.
We had a natural alliance with Iran. Iran has Jewish members of its assembly and parliament. Persia, it's been a long time since Persia and Israel were at war, a few thousand years.
Right.
Is it possible Zarif, the foreign minister, of Iran, will secretly meet with some Israeli counterpart at some point, and will realize both Israel and the United States that maybe we need a balance?
Look, historically, there was an Israeli-Iranian
Correct.
relationship. Almost 80% of their strikes are against the non-ISIS Sunni opposition. And we look to be in league with the Russians right now because we're promoting a diplomatic process that the Russians aren't doing a whole lot to promote, but they're a part of. The Sunnis are not going to join this struggle if it looks like they're joining a fight against Sunnis. If we favored, for example, a safe haven in Syria where A, you'd staunch the flow of refugees going to Europe, B, you'd have a place for Sunnis to go in Syria, C, the humanitarian quarters would somehow be created so they could get there, you'd be in a different place. Sunnis it would then look like we're trying to protect Sunnis. Until we do that, or until the process in Syria takes on a different coloration. I mean, here, if Putin were serious about this diplomatic process, he would go to Assad and he would say, all right, you have to stop the barrel bombs and we're going to open up humanitarian quarters so starvation won't any longer be a tool in the fight. And he would come to us and he would say, I'm going to do that, but you got to get the Turks, you got to get the Saudis, you got to get the Qataris.
And I would like you to address both those questions.
Well, look, I mean, I said before, the way Gaza was done is not the way I would have liked to have seen it done, but it's a legitimate question. It's one of the reasons separation, especially now. Look, you're an Israeli, you're looking out at the region, and you're afraid you get out of the West Bank, and who's going to be there? They worry that, well, ISIS will be there. I mean, ISIS or Hamas will be there. Now, the Palestinians would say, well, we're taking care of the security, and most of the Israeli security people would say they're doing some things, but they're not doing everything. So what I'm saying about separation is, I'm not saying, let's not treat it as a slogan. Let's look at it in a hard way. Let's look at it systematically. First, let's define it, and then let's think through what would it take to be able to produce security, meaningful security, so that you don't face the possible threats that could take place if there was some kind of vacuum left there. What would you have to do with the Palestinians to ensure security? What kind of Israeli presence would have to be available to deal with security? So I'm not saying let's go launch separation. What I'm saying is separation right now is an objective that could make sense. You got to think it through. And now, in truth, it's another way. Walter, you've heard me say this before. I've also favored the idea of coordinated unilateralism. If it's too hard to negotiate agreements because it crosses too many ideological thresholds, coordinated unilateralism is another way to go. And that's in separation. When I say separation, it's another way of talking about and
I mean, that's the answer to me to the security question, is the Sunni
Right.
Arab nations have to...
it would have to be part of it. But that's the way you would do it. And then, but I just said, but you would ask them, what role would you like the United States to play? What would you expect the United States to play? Now, that these days they might say, honestly, they might say very little.
We see that's a small difference of tone, which is instead of us telling them what role we want them to play,
Right.
we would be asking them what role do you want us to play as you try
Right.
to broker
Right.
some of these security arrangements,
Right.
if there were...
But that is what I would do.
Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, coming back to Syria and
Yeah.
the Gulf states' role there,
those who weren't prepared to fight. Where they don't succeed is if they're fighting in certain villages where there's a local capacity and they're prepared to fight for their home village, then they have more of a problem. So what you're talking about is a combination of things. Sunni tribes who are local, with some Sunni governments providing some forces, not large forces, but some forces on the ground.
Or be indicted by the World Court. Is this great concern in Israel?
And by the way, let me thank the Gildenhorns who helped sponsor these lunch series. Thank you all very much. Go ahead.
You know, that's been going to the ICC, going to the UN. That has been, for Palestinians, they say, you know, this is an alternative to using violence. But for Israelis, they see it as part of a delegitimization move. And delegitimization, if you're delegitimizing the state, how are you supposed to work out a two-state outcome? It doesn't have a lot of momentum behind it right now, again, because not a lot of who's paying attention? I mean, what drives, there's a lot of sources for anger among the 15 to 25-year-olds among Palestinians. One is that no one's paying attention. Certainly the Arabs aren't paying attention. The world doesn't seem to be paying attention. So, you know, when Abu Mazen says he's going to go to the UN, beyond, what would it be about? I do think if it was a completely one-sided resolution, the administration would probably still veto it. But it really depends on what the content is.
Ken Meyercord, WorldX. When did we start paying the Palestinian Authority $400 million a year? And how much of that money actually ended up in Israel's hands as payment for the various things that it charges the Palestinian Authority for?
We started providing assistance to the Palestinian Authority after the Palestinian Authority was created in the 1990s. The Palestinian Authority emerged from the Oslo process. And in Syria, what you've seen in Iraq, what you see in Yemen, what you see in Libya has had a chilling effect. You know, there's obviously real turmoil in Egypt today. And yet, you know, by most measures, President Sisi remains pretty popular. And it's not that everybody's happy with everything, obviously, but there's a sense that he provides an alternative to what they see all around him. You know, there was a push within Jordan at a certain point, but you don't see that now. And again, there's a chilling effect. No one wants to look like Syria. You know, no one wants to go through that, you know, just catastrophic set of consequences. So while I'm not sitting here and saying, you know, that we can't see more revolutions take place, we can't see more leadership swept away, you know, for the last couple of years we haven't seen that. And I do think it's a mistake not to understand that there has been a real chilling effect throughout the rest of the region of the kind of upheaval. I mean, one of the more interesting polls I saw, there was a poll done last year that I saw of 18 to 26-year-olds throughout the whole region. And it compared where they were in looking to lead revolutions. And if you look at that polling, it's very different than it was going back to 2011.
And have our attitudes, meaning U.S. leadership attitudes, also changed? Because when the Arab Spring happened, we kind of inelegantly tried to figure out, do we want Mubarak to go?
Yeah.
Frank Wisner and
Yeah.
Secretary Clinton and all.
Yeah.
In retrospect, should we have chosen more stability?
Should be more emphasized.
Well, in a sense, what I was just saying is that the poll I was citing pretty much reflected economics as the preoccupation. Wanting jobs is kind of the preoccupation. It's not a big surprise. And you know, look, we're also at a point where, given the low price of oil, the idea that the oil states can help finance a lot of these things, that's much less likely now. So, you know, we are, on the one hand, we're drawn to the fact that ISIS is a threat to us and we have to do something about it. But what comes after ISIS, if you succeed, again, we were talking earlier, you need Sunnis on the ground, you need governance afterwards. I mean, take a place like Ramadi. Ramadi gets mostly liberated. I mean, I think it's largely liberated now. If there's no reconstruction, if Sunnis can't come back and live there again, if there isn't a sense that that at least the Sunnis there and elsewhere are going to get a piece of the pie, well, you know what? The next manifestation of ISIS will come back. And work this out by saying, gee, why don't we separate that way? When I talk about separation between Israelis and Palestinians, it's because look at what we see right now.
Okay, but let me get to a smaller example of that, which was what was purported to be Vice President Biden's notion that after Iraq, let it become a federated.
Right. A federated approach makes perfect sense. But even that, it's taking place in an area where there's conflict. In those places where you have conflict, do I think Syria is going to be put back together again? Highly unlikely.
In Iraq?
Iraq, only in a kind of federal arrangement.
But so you're getting to where I was asking.
The short answer is, in these kinds of places, where you have a conflict, the resolution probably is going to create some kind of federal arrangement. In Iraq, they may want to maintain the Iraqi national identity, but under that broad rubric, as I was saying before, look, Sunnis want to have...
The many decades of negotiations that have been held between the Palestinians and the Israelis, that the Israelis ultimately have used these negotiations very astutely for their own advantage, that occupation has expanded, resettlement has bloomed. Where have the consequences ever been for
reality that you're talking about? If we're going to change what Palestinians see as a dead end for them, then separation is one way to begin to get at that. Because separation, first, if the Israelis stop building outside the blocks, one of the things that has driven a Palestinian sense of powerlessness has been settlement building. So suddenly, outside the blocks, which is where most of the Israeli population is in the West Bank and where there's not a very big Palestinian population, suddenly you go outside the blocks, Palestinians aren't going to see Israeli building. Well, that immediately changes the psychology and the perception that you were describing. So one of the reasons I'm very big on affecting realities on the ground is because if you're going to deal with the cynicism and disbelief, something has to look different than what they have seen. If you were to announce a resumption of negotiations, it would have no impact on the two